The story opens with a bustling Ohio airport. Amid the usual noise, Officer Thatcher Mullen watches as Bishop, his Belgian Malinois, grows agitated. He focuses on one person, a pregnant woman, Marlo Ashford. As Marlo moves past them, Bishop suddenly barks loudly and relentlessly, as if sensing an impending danger. As Marlo collapses on the floor, her belongings spill out. Papers, a small stuffed bear, and a crumpled envelope. The envelope, stained with sweat and urgency, catches Thatcher's eye. Written on it is a single word: sorry. A chilling feeling sweeps over him, and he realizes this is just the beginning of something much bigger. Before diving into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit the like button if you're excited for this journey. Officer Thatcher Mullen had been with Red Hollow International Airport for over a decade. A man of few words, he was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering trust in his canine partner, Bishop, a Belgian Malinois with an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Thatcher and Bishop had a bond that went beyond the professional. It was a partnership forged in the field, with Bishop often detecting threats before Thatcher even had a chance to react. The dog had saved his life on more than one occasion, alerting him to suspicious individuals or dangerous situations that others might have missed. Thatcher's life had been shaped by the companionship of his four-legged partner, and he trusted Bishop's instincts more than his own at times. Bishop was a striking dog, tall, lean, and agile, with a coat that shimmered a deep brown in the sunlight. His eyes were sharp, always scanning the surroundings, and his demeanor was calm but watchful. In the past, Thatcher had been part of a specialized canine unit where Bishop had proven himself an invaluable asset in detecting explosives, drugs, and even tracking suspects. They had worked in high-pressure environments, including large public events and crime investigations, and Bishop had always come through, no matter the challenge. Outside of work, Thatcher was a man of routine. He enjoyed the simplicity of his life, with little to distract him from his duties. His quiet, no-nonsense approach earned him respect from his colleagues and admiration from those who knew him well. Despite his outward stoicism, there was a side of him that carried the weight of past regrets, especially from a mission that still haunted him. That mission had involved his former friend and comrade, Hollis Rare. Hollis had been a soldier with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of loyalty. The two had served together in the military, and they shared a bond built on trust and shared experience. But Hollis had died in the line of duty, leaving Thatcher with a heavy heart and a lingering sense of guilt. The loss of his friend, coupled with the secrets surrounding their final mission, had left a permanent scar in Thatcher's soul. As Thatcher and Bishop stood guard at the airport, their routine was broken when the pregnant woman walked by. Bishop's reaction was immediate, intense, and completely out of character. It was a sign, a signal that something was about to unfold, something that would drag both Thatcher and Marlo Ashford into a world of mystery, betrayal, and danger they never expected. Marlo Ashford was a woman whose exterior betrayed little of the storm raging inside her. At first glance, she seemed like just another traveler, moving through the crowds at Red Hollow International Airport with the ease of someone used to the hustle of busy terminals. But there was something about her that didn't quite fit. She was tall, blonde, and poised, with a calm that seemed unnatural for someone in the final trimester of pregnancy. Her oversized sunglasses shielded her eyes, hiding a quiet intensity behind them. Her flat shoes, chosen for comfort, were an unexpected choice for someone who had dressed in dark, elegant clothing, a navy coat and white blouse, both chosen for style, yet showing the signs of someone desperately trying to blend into the background. In the airport, where emotions ran high, goodbyes, reunions, the frenetic energy of travel, Marlo's demeanor stood out. She moved slowly, carefully, her hand resting on her rounded belly, as if trying to shield the life growing within her from a world that felt too heavy, too uncertain. Her eyes scanned the crowd, never lingering too long on any one face. She seemed to be searching for something, perhaps safety, or maybe an escape from something far more dangerous. But whatever it was, she carried it alone. Marlo's calm exterior was a carefully constructed facade, built over years of hiding the pain and fear she felt beneath the surface. Her past was a web of secrets, one that she had spent her adult life trying to outrun. The woman in front of Thatcher didn't just carry a child, she carried the weight of an unresolved past, one that had followed her from the shadows of her childhood into the present. For as long as Marlowe could remember, she had been running. Running from memories, from truth, from the very people who had created her. Her mother, Lena, had always been distant, cryptic in her words, and overprotective in her own way. Marlowe had never known the full story behind her family's history, only that it was filled with things better left forgotten. The last few months had brought her to a point of reckoning. A pregnancy that was both a blessing and a curse, an unexpected tie to a past she couldn't outrun. In the midst of this turmoil, Marlowe had made the decision to travel to Ohio, hoping to find answers. The airport was her first stop, the beginning of her search for the truth. But the second she crossed paths with Officer Thatcher Mullen and Bishop, her carefully constructed world began to unravel. Little did she know, this chance encounter would lead her straight into the heart of a mystery that would change everything she knew about herself and the world around her. Bishop had always been reliable. More than just a partner, he was Thatcher's eyes in a way. The Belgian Malinois had an uncanny ability to read situations, a sixth sense that made him invaluable on the job. Normally, Bishop was a calm, focused dog, alert but never reactive unless it was absolutely necessary. But when Marlowe Ashford walked past them, something in the air shifted. It began subtly. Thatcher noticed it first when Bishop's ears perked up. The dog's gaze snapped to Marlowe, his body stiffening as he followed her movements through the crowd. Thatcher glanced at the woman, but dismissed the moment as nothing more than the dog reacting to an unfamiliar scent. But then Bishop's tail began to twitch, his eyes narrowing, and his movements grew restless. His muscles tensed. It wasn't like the usual behavior of a working dog on high alert. Bishop didn't show the aggression he'd sometimes display around suspects or dangerous situations. This was different. It was as if Bishop could sense something threatening in Marlowe's presence, something Thatcher couldn't see. His gaze never left her as she walked by, and for a moment it was as though he was tracking her every move. Then it happened. Without warning, Bishop froze, his body rigid with tension. His low growl began to rumble from deep within his chest, soft at first, but building in intensity. The growl was unusual enough for Thatcher to take notice, but it was the next sound that truly unsettled him. A sharp, unmistakable bark. One bark quickly followed by another, then another, each one louder than the last. It wasn't a bark of aggression but a warning, urgent, insistent, as if trying to communicate something that Thatcher couldn't understand. Thatcher's first instinct was to pull back on the leash, attempting to regain control over the dog. But Bishop didn't respond, his back arched and his eyes fixed firmly on Marlowe, who continued walking, oblivious to the escalating reaction behind her. The dog's behavior wasn't normal. Bishop had never acted like this around anyone, let alone a pregnant woman. It was clear something deeper was at play, something beyond the surface. "Bishop," Thatcher muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on the leash. The dog wasn't calming down. Instead, his barking became more frantic, his body shaking as if fighting against something unseen. Thatcher felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't know why, but something told him this woman, this stranger, was connected to whatever was making Bishop act so violently. Without thinking, Thatcher found himself stepping forward, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. Something in the air felt off, very off. Marlowe's steps faltered as she moved further down the terminal, the sound of Bishop's frantic barking echoing in the space behind her. It was as if her body had sensed the growing unease around her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Her gaze remained forward, focused on an unseen destination, though her pulse quickened at the strange energy in the air. Thatcher, still holding on to Bishop's leash, tried to maintain control. He called out to Marlowe, his voice firm but respectful. "I need you to stop for a moment." Marlowe hesitated. There was a slight pause, as if she was weighing the decision. Then, without a word, she took 2 more steps and collapsed on the cold airport tiles. Her body hit the ground with a thud, the force sending her bags scattering across the floor, the contents spilling out in all directions. Papers, small bottles, a sealed envelope, and a tiny stuffed bear. People around her froze in shock, their eyes wide with confusion and concern, but no one moved toward her. Thatcher dropped beside her, instinctively reaching for his radio. "Medical backup now," he ordered, his voice sharp as he scanned the area. The atmosphere shifted as the urgency of the situation took hold, but even as the chaos unfolded around them, one thing was undeniable. Bishop wouldn't stop barking. The dog, now agitated to the point of desperation, howled in panic, as if he were trying to convey a message that no one could understand. Bishop's growls had turned to whines, the sound guttural and broken, like the dog had lost all sense of composure. His body quivered, and his eyes were locked onto Marlowe as though he was guarding something or someone vital. Thatcher tried to calm the dog, pulling on the leash, but it was futile. Bishop wasn't moving. In the midst of this, Thatcher's eyes caught something, an envelope near Marlowe's hand. It was crumpled, stained with sweat, and faintly torn at the edges. Thatcher's pulse quickened as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the paper. The letter was carefully folded, and written on it, in deliberate and shaky cursive, was a single word: "Sorry." The word struck Thatcher like a punch to the chest, the weight of its meaning hitting him before he could even process it. His mind raced. Why would this woman, this stranger, have such a cryptic, seemingly tragic note on her? As the paramedics rushed to tend to Marlowe, Thatcher couldn't shake the feeling that this letter, this word, was far from an ordinary message. It was a warning, a symbol of something much bigger than just a collapse in a busy terminal. What was happening to Marlowe, and why had Bishop reacted so strongly? The questions swirled in his mind as the scene around him continued to escalate. But one thing was certain: the story had only just begun. If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more gripping content and join our growing community. As the paramedics quickly assessed Marlowe's condition and moved her onto a stretcher, Thatcher remained by her side, his mind racing. His eyes flickered between the unconscious woman and his dog Bishop, who had finally calmed, but was still watching her intently. Thatcher's thoughts were in overdrive, struggling to piece together the fragments of a situation that didn't make sense. The letter, the strange reaction from Bishop, and now Marlowe, lying motionless in front of him with a military dog tag still clutched tightly in her left hand. It was then that Thatcher noticed it. As the paramedics lifted her onto the gurney, the dog tag slipped partially from her grasp. Thatcher's heart skipped a beat. His pulse quickened as he bent down to retrieve the tag, knowing that he'd seen that name before. "Hollis Rare," Thatcher whispered, almost to himself. The name etched into the metal was like a dagger to his chest. It was a name he hadn't heard in over 2 decades, a name from his past that he had buried deep within his memory, one he thought he'd long forgotten. Hollis Rare had been his friend, his comrade in arms, a man he had served with in the military, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances during their last mission. The pain from that loss still lingered in Thatcher's heart, though he had buried it deep under layers of routine and duty. To see the name now, on this woman's necklace of all places, was nothing short of shocking. The paramedics, unaware of the significance of the name, continued their work as Thatcher stood frozen, staring at the dog tag. His mind raced, trying to reconcile this new reality. How could this woman, this Marlowe Ashford, have something that belonged to Hollis? Was she related to him? But if she was, why had she been carrying it now, 2 decades after his death? As the paramedics rushed Marlowe into the back of an ambulance, Thatcher could feel the weight of the dog tag in his hand, its cold metal seeming to pulse with an unspoken urgency. He tucked it into his coat pocket, instinctively knowing he needed to protect it, though he wasn't sure why. There was no logical explanation for the connection, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all tied together. The dog's warning, the word sorry on the letter, and now this mysterious dog tag. Bishop, still by his side, gave a low whine as if sensing his unease. Thatcher looked down at the dog, who was still staring at the ambulance as it pulled away, his eyes unwavering. There was something deeper at play here, something far beyond a simple airport incident. As he made his way back to his patrol car, the weight of the dog tag in his pocket felt heavier with each step. There was a hidden truth buried within all of this, and Thatcher knew that finding out what it was would mean uncovering a past he had never truly left behind. But for now, All he could do was follow the trail, one piece at a time. And it seemed that Marlo Ashford was the key to unlocking it all. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Thatcher's thoughts were consumed by one question. How was Marlo connected to Hollis? It made no sense. Hollis Rare had been a friend, a brother in arms. They had shared the harshest experiences of war together, trusted each other with their lives. And then, without warning, Hollis had disappeared. His death had been shrouded in mystery, the details vague and swept under the rug, as if the military was trying to bury both the man and the truth. Thatcher never wanted to revisit the past, but now the past was coming for him, dragging him back into a world he had hoped to forget. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore, the letter, the dog tag, and now Marlo. His mind raced as he tried to fit the pieces together. When he arrived at the hospital, Marlo was unconscious, and the sterile white walls of the emergency room did little to ease the tension gnawing at him. He had seen too much in his years on the force to ignore the weight of the situation. It was clear that Marlo wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had been connected to something dark and dangerous, a secret he wasn't ready to confront. He went straight to the hospital's records, requesting any information on Marlo Ashford. What he found was startling, yet strangely familiar. There was no record of her parents. Her mother, Lena, had lived under several different names, moving frequently from place to place, never staying long enough to leave any trace. But what truly caught Thatcher's attention was an old military file that referenced Hollis's last known mission. In the file, it mentioned a woman named Lena. His mind clicked into place. Lena had been more than just a civilian. She had been a translator during one of their covert operations in Kandahar, and she had been intimately involved in a project that was supposed to stay buried. Thatcher's heart sank as he realized the impossible truth. Marlo wasn't just connected to Hollis. She was his daughter. But why hadn't Hollis ever mentioned her? Why had he kept this part of his life a secret? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and he turned to see a young nurse walking toward him with a folder in her hand. She hesitated, then handed him the folder containing Marlo's medical records. The nurse, noticing the deep concentration on his face, added, "She's awake, Officer Mullen. She's asking for you." The weight of those words hit him like a punch. Marlo Ashford, the woman who had collapsed in front of him, was awake and waiting for answers. But Thatcher wasn't sure he was ready for the truth. Still, he had to face it. When he entered her room, he found her sitting up in the bed, her pale face a mask of both relief and confusion. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was an unspoken recognition between them. She wasn't just a random woman he had encountered at the airport. She was a piece of a puzzle he had never intended to solve, a ghost from a past that was finally coming to claim him. "Do you know who I am?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly, but there was a calm in her eyes that made Thatcher feel as though she already knew more than he did. Thatcher paused, the weight of her question hanging in the air. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the dog tag. He placed it gently on her bedside table. "Is this yours?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Marlo's hand instinctively reached out for the tag. The moment her fingers touched it, her face softened, but there was also a flicker of pain in her eyes. She looked up at Thatcher, her gaze steady. "It's my father's," she said, her voice barely audible. "Hollis Rare. He was my father." The confirmation hit Thatcher like a wave of cold water. Everything, the barking, the letter, the dog tag, was connected to a past that no one wanted to remember. But the truth was undeniable. Hollis had been more than just a soldier. He had been Marlo's father, and now, through her, Thatcher was being pulled back into a world he had long buried. He didn't know what to say next. All he could do was nod, as the truth settled in, heavy and unrelenting. Marlo sat on the hospital bed, staring at the dog tag and the envelope with the word "sorry" etched across it. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed distant, compared to the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions racing through her mind. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her life, her past, none of it made sense anymore. She had always been told her parents were lost to her long ago, that her mother, Lena, was the only one left of her family. Lena had always been cryptic, keeping Marlowe at arm's length, protecting her from truths that could shatter the delicate walls she'd built around herself. But this revelation that Hollis Rare, a man she had never met, was her father, it shook her to her core. And what did that mean? What kind of legacy had he left behind? Thatcher, standing by the door, felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had known Hollis better than anyone. He had stood by him in war zones, had trusted him in ways only soldiers could understand. But now, standing in front of the daughter of his fallen comrade, Thatcher was faced with a truth that was both familiar and alien. Hollis had died with secrets. Now those secrets were seeping into the present, threatening to undo everything. He could see the pain in Marlowe's eyes, the confusion, the hurt of a woman who had spent her life trying to fill in the gaps of her past, only to find out it was more complicated than she ever imagined. His instincts told him to help her, to provide the clarity she was desperate for, but his own emotions were tangled in the web. He had never thought much about what happened to Hollis after his death, but now that the pieces were falling into place, the weight of the situation became unbearable. "How long have you known?" Marlowe's voice was soft, almost too soft, but the intensity behind her words cut through the silence. Thatcher hesitated. He hadn't wanted to answer her question. He wasn't sure he had the words. "Not long," he finally admitted. "The dog tag. It's how I knew. I didn't know you were connected to him." He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "I didn't know he had a child. He kept that part of his life hidden. We were soldiers, Marlowe. We were focused on the mission, not things like family." The admission hung in the air between them. Marlowe stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the truth. She was a woman who had spent her life looking for something, anything, to explain who she was and why her mother had kept her in the dark. And now here was a man who had known her father, a man who had been there in the final moments of Hollis's life. But his words felt distant, almost like they weren't enough to bridge the chasm of years between them. "Why didn't he tell me about this?" Marlowe's voice cracked as she reached for the dog tag again. She traced the name with her fingers, but it was clear that the answers she sought were more than just a name on metal. She needed to understand why Hollis hadn't been there for her, why he had died without telling her the truth of who he really was. Thatcher's gaze softened. He stepped closer, but still kept his distance. He wanted to offer comfort, but he knew better. "I don't have the answers, Marlowe," he said quietly. "I wish I did. Hollis, he had his own demons. He wasn't perfect. None of us are." The words seemed to linger between them. Thatcher could see the deep internal struggle that Marlowe was fighting, her need for answers, her yearning for closure, and yet the fear of what those answers might reveal. He understood that fear all too well. The past had a way of coming back when you least expected it, and sometimes the truth was far more painful than the silence. As Thatcher turned to leave the room, he hesitated. "I'll find out what happened to him, Marlowe," he said, his voice firm. "I owe it to you, to him, to everyone who deserves the truth. We'll get to the bottom of this." Marlowe looked up at him, her face still a mixture of confusion and longing. For a brief moment, Thatcher saw the same pain in her eyes that had haunted him for years, the same haunted look that had driven him to keep his distance from his own past. But now, in this moment, he realized he couldn't turn away. Not anymore. As the days passed, the weight of the situation only grew heavier for both Thatcher and Marlowe. The truth of Hollis's hidden past was like a slow burn, consuming them both with unanswered questions. Thatcher's every instinct told him to uncover the full story, to bring the truth to light, but the more he delved into Hollis's life, the deeper the mystery seemed to get, and the more he learned, the more dangerous it became. Marlowe, on the other hand, was struggling with something even more profound. She wasn't just uncovering the truth about her father, she was confronting the life she had unknowingly been a part of. The lies, the hidden military operations, and the secrets that had been kept from her for so long. Her life had been built on a foundation of uncertainty and half-truths, but now each new revelation felt like a puzzle piece falling into place, each one making her feel more connected to a past she hadn't known existed. She sat in her small apartment, staring at the collection of documents Thatcher had managed to obtain from his investigation. The dog tag. The mysterious letter, the military files, all of it was leading somewhere, but she couldn't quite see the path yet. She couldn't help but feel as though she was being pulled into something far larger than herself, something that she wasn't sure she was ready for. As she sifted through papers, one phrase kept popping up: Project Helix. The name was everywhere, though its meaning was unclear. She had heard whispers of it from her mother, Lena, but never understood its significance. Now, as she traced the words on the page, something stirred within her. A memory, a feeling she couldn't quite place. The project seemed to have some connection to her father's final mission, and the deeper she looked into it, the more it seemed like everything had been connected from the very beginning. Thatcher, too, had been chasing down leads, speaking to old contacts who had known Hollis, trying to piece together what had really happened during their last mission together. The more he uncovered, the more it became clear that there was a covert operation, a hidden agenda that Marlowe was somehow tied to. The higher-ups had always kept things under wraps, erasing any trace of their involvement. But the deeper Thatcher dug, the more he realized that Hollis had been trying to expose something that could take down the very system that had orchestrated his death. And then came the threats. Thatcher started receiving anonymous calls, voices distorted, names blurred, and warnings clear. "Stay away from her, Officer Mullen," one voice had said. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Another had simply said, "She's not just a woman. She's the key to something far more dangerous than you can imagine." The more threats he received, the more resolute Thatcher became. He couldn't back down now. Marlowe had become more than just an innocent bystander in this unraveling mystery. She was part of something far bigger, and Thatcher was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. He knew he had a choice: to walk away and protect himself, or stand by Marlowe and risk everything. Meanwhile, Marlowe's own search for answers led her into darker corners. She had gone to the airport again, the place where everything had started. It was quiet, late at night, and the silence made the tension in her chest grow. She had to see it for herself, the place where she had collapsed. As she stood there, walking through the terminal, memories started to surface, disjointed fragments of a life she had pushed away. The cold tile floor, the echoes of Bishop's barking, and the brief moments when she had felt a strange sense of recognition as though she had been there before. It was then that she found the key to the puzzle, the key that could unlock everything. Hidden in a locked drawer at the airport's Lost and Found was a folder with her name on it. Inside, she discovered something that would forever change the course of her life. Project Helix, her involvement in it, her genetic profile, and a list of others who had been a part of the program. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She wasn't just the daughter of Hollis Rare. She was the result of an experiment, part of something the world was never meant to know. Her entire life had been manipulated, orchestrated, all for a purpose she hadn't been privy to. The walls of her world crumbled. What had she been born for? And why was she being hunted? She had no answers. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to run anymore. The truth was out there, and now she would go after it, no matter the danger. The pieces were falling into place: her father's legacy, her mother's lies, the project that had shaped her existence. And in that moment, Marlowe knew that the only way forward was to face the past head-on, with or without Thatcher by her side. This character really deserves a like, but sadly, they haven't gotten one yet. Help us show support for them. The air was thick with tension as Thatcher stood outside the abandoned warehouse, the cold night pressing against him like a weight. The mission had been clear: get to the heart of this conspiracy, uncover the truth, and if necessary, fight to protect it. But as he glanced at Marlowe, who stood beside him, the gravity of the situation hit him in waves. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was personal. The woman beside him was no longer a stranger or a victim. She was the key to everything, and the truth had already started to unfold. Marlowe had changed since that first day at the airport. Her transformation had been swift, almost brutal. The confusion she had felt earlier had given way to a cold, determined clarity. She was ready. For the first time, she felt like she was in control, even if the truth about her own life and the mysterious forces behind it were still clouded in shadows. The years of searching for answers had led her here, to a night that could very well be her last, or the beginning of everything she had fought for. They had followed a trail of encrypted messages, hidden files, and anonymous tips to this warehouse, a place marked as abandoned on all maps, but in reality it was the heart of a network more dangerous than anything they had anticipated. Project Helix wasn't just a covert military operation. It was a breeding ground for secrets, lies, and experiments that had shaped the fates of individuals like Marlowe. The truth was buried here, under layers of protection, under the silence of those who had been involved. The hum of a distant generator echoed from inside the warehouse. They were close. Thatcher's hand instinctively went to the weapon at his side, his mind already calculating the risks. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Marlowe's life, and the life of everyone who had been affected by the project, depended on what they did next. They moved in, careful and methodical. The warehouse loomed in front of them, its towering silhouette outlined against the dim city lights. The door was ajar, and the faint sounds of voices reached their ears. Inside, a group of men were huddled around a table, speaking in low tones. The presence of security guards made the situation even more dangerous. As they entered, the quiet was shattered by the sound of a gunshot. One of the guards had spotted them, his sharp eyes picking out the intruders in the dark. The air erupted into chaos. "Get down!" Thatcher shouted as he instinctively pulled Marlowe toward cover. A burst of gunfire erupted from behind them, the deafening sound ricocheting off the walls of the warehouse. Thatcher ducked, returning fire as Marlowe crouched beside him, her breathing shallow but steady. She was no longer the frightened woman she had once been. She moved with purpose, her gaze steely as she helped clear the area. "Keep moving," Thatcher barked. "We need to find the control room. The truth's in there." They pushed forward, navigating through a maze of crates and narrow passages. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of secrets about to be revealed. The flickering lights above them cast eerie shadows, making everything feel like a trap. But this wasn't a time to hesitate. They had come too far. In the heart of the warehouse, they finally found the control room. The door was locked, but Marlowe, using the knowledge she had unlocked from her past, managed to override the system with a code she had never known she remembered. The door hissed open, and inside they found rows of monitors, stacks of files, and the heart of Project Helix's operation. It was everything they had been searching for, and more. The documents were riddled with codes, names, and details that were chilling in their implications. One file caught Thatcher's eye immediately. It was labeled Subject 6A. Marlowe's name was listed in the margins, alongside a string of other individuals who had been part of the program. Their faces were blurred, but the significance was clear. These were the people who had been manipulated, used as pawns in a dangerous game. Marlowe's hand shook as she reached for the file. She scanned the documents quickly, her mind racing to connect the dots. The name Lena Ashford appeared several times, and the realization hit her hard. Her mother had been more than just a protector. She had been complicit in the project, possibly even a driving force behind it. Marlowe had always suspected her mother was hiding something, but now the truth was unbearable. Her mother had helped create a system that turned human lives into experiments, and Marlowe had been caught in its web from the very beginning. But before she could process the magnitude of the discovery, a voice cut through the tension. "Did you really think you could uncover the truth?" A figure stepped from the shadows, his face cold and calculating. Dr. Julian Crest, the man behind Project Helix, stood before them. His graying hair and gaunt face were familiar from the files they had uncovered. He was the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated everything. "You've been chasing ghosts," Crest said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "But what you don't realize is that the project was never meant to be exposed. It's too dangerous. You don't understand the power it holds." Marlowe's fists clenched. "You did this to us, to me. My father died protecting me from people like you. You used my life as a weapon." Crest smiled faintly, as though enjoying her outrage. "Your father was a soldier, Marlowe. He understood the stakes. He knew what needed to be done. The problem was, he didn't see the bigger picture, and neither do you." With that, the door behind him slammed shut. The room was suddenly flooded with light as men in tactical gear stormed in, weapons drawn. Marlowe and Thatcher were trapped, but even in the face of overwhelming odds, they weren't going to give up. Thatcher's grip tightened on his weapon, and Marlowe, standing tall beside him, locked eyes with Crest. "You might have controlled everything up until now," she said, her voice steady, "but we're not your puppets anymore." Thatcher moved first, the silence broken by a barrage of gunfire. Marlowe dove for cover as the battle erupted around them. The fight was fierce, but they fought with everything they had. Each shot, each movement, was driven by a singular purpose: to expose the truth and bring down the machine that had tried to destroy them. When the dust settled, the warehouse was in ruins, and the final moments of the confrontation left them battered but victorious. Marlowe had faced the truth of her past, and with it, she had found the strength to take control of her future. The warehouse was silent now, save for the faint hum of the broken generator, the low crackling of fire from a few smoldering crates, and the echo of their heavy breathing. Thatcher and Marlowe were both covered in dirt and blood, their clothes torn from the chaos of the battle that had just unfolded. The men sent by Dr. Julian Crest lay unconscious or motionless around them, their weapons scattered, their plans shattered. But there was no time to rest. There was one more thing they had to do. Marlowe stood at the center of the room, her face pale, but her eyes alight with determination. Thatcher stood beside her, his posture guarded, his gaze flickering to the monitors still displaying the files of Project Helix, files that had torn apart everything Marlowe thought she knew about her past. The truth was out now, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about something bigger, a system of corruption and exploitation that had shaped her entire life. "You were right," Marlowe said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "All of this, it's been hidden for so long, and now it's all coming to light. I can't stop here. We need to expose it all. We need to make them pay for everything they've done." Thatcher's eyes met hers, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw not a woman searching for answers, but a force of nature determined to bring justice. She had already been through so much, and yet she was not broken. She was stronger than ever. "You're not alone in this," Thatcher replied, his voice low but resolute. He had made up his mind. This wasn't just about his duty anymore. It wasn't just about finding answers for himself. This was about righting the wrongs that had been done to them both, and to everyone else who had been caught in the web of Project Helix. He had spent too many years protecting secrets, hiding behind a badge, running from his past. Now, he would face it head on. The finality of their conversation hung in the air like a declaration of war. There was no going back. The system they were up against wasn't just a military project. It was a machine, a well-oiled apparatus of control and manipulation, run by people who were willing to do anything to protect their interests. But Marlowe had uncovered the truth, and now she had the power to bring it down. "How do we do this?" Marlowe asked, her voice still calm but edged with the tension of what was to come. Thatcher looked around the room, his mind working quickly. They had destroyed the physical files, but the information was still stored on the computers. The network needed to be taken down. The data had to be broadcast, made public, for the world to see what had been done in the shadows. There were still connections that needed to be severed, people who needed to be held accountable. "We used the system against them," Thatcher said. "We wiped the servers, but we also broadcast everything to the press, to the public. Everything about Project Helix, everything about you, your father, your mother, everything they've tried to keep hidden for all these years. No more secrets." Marlowe nodded, her resolve hardening. "But it won't stop there, will it?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with understanding. "They'll come after us. They'll do anything to silence us." "That's why we don't just stop with the data," Thatcher replied. "We make sure it's out in the open, on every news station, every social media outlet. We make sure people know what happened, and we make sure they can't bury this any longer." It was a dangerous plan, one that would surely make them targets. But it was the only way to ensure that everything, the truth about the lives destroyed, the people manipulated, the lives taken, would not be buried again. Marlowe wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. As Thatcher moved to the control panel, he started working to upload the data. He had no illusions about what was at stake. They would be hunted. Project Helix had been buried for so long because powerful people had fought to keep it that way. But once the world knew, once the truth was out there, it would be harder for anyone to deny it. Marlowe stood beside him, watching the data transfer. Her mind raced, but in her heart she knew this was the right thing to do. She thought of her father, of the life he had tried to protect her from, and the terrible price he had paid. She thought of the years of running, of never truly knowing who she was, and now, finally she could say she understood. "I'm doing this for him," she whispered, mostly to herself. Thatcher glanced up at her. "I know." And then the screen flashed red. A voice, cold and detached, came over the intercom, interrupting the silence. "You think you can stop us? You've exposed nothing. You're playing a dangerous game, Mullen. You and the girl. We've been watching you both for longer than you know." Marlowe's eyes flickered, her grip tightening on the gun she had taken from one of the fallen guards. She wasn't intimidated. "It's already too late," she said firmly. "The world will know. You can't stop it." The voice on the intercom went silent. The power flickered in the room, but the transfer was complete. The data had been uploaded. The truth would soon be revealed to the world. Thatcher turned to face Marlowe. There was a moment of quiet understanding between them, a silent agreement that they had done what they could. But the battle was far from over. They had exposed the conspiracy, but they hadn't taken down the people behind it. Not yet. "We've done what we came to do," Thatcher said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the task ahead. "Now we just need to survive the fallout." Marlowe nodded, her face grim. "We will. We have to." As they made their way toward the exit, ready to face whatever came next, neither of them had any illusions about what the future held. They had taken a stand, and now the world would see the truth. And in doing so, they had given themselves a chance to fight for a future free from the shadows of the past. The journey wasn't over, but it was a beginning, one that would change everything. The silence in the warehouse was deafening after the battle had subsided. The air smelled of smoke, dust, and the lingering tension of a fight that had been far more than a simple confrontation. It had been the final step in unraveling years of secrecy and manipulation. The monitors that had once displayed the files of Project Helix now sat dormant, their screens flickering intermittently as the power supply waned. For the first time in what felt like forever, Thatcher and Marlowe stood still, taking in the weight of what had just transpired. Marlowe's hand trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Her clothes were torn, and there were small cuts and bruises on her face. But they were nothing compared to the storm inside her. She had always known something was off, something buried deep in her past. But now, as she stood in the ruins of the warehouse that had been the heart of the operation that had controlled her life, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The truth was out. The truth about her father, about her mother, about everything they had tried to hide. It was finally in the open. Yet, that relief was tempered by the overwhelming sense of loss. She had uncovered the truth about her father, but she had also learned things about her mother that shattered her understanding of everything she had once believed. Lena had been more than a protector. She had been complicit in a system that exploited her own daughter, hiding her in plain sight and keeping her a pawn in a game she never asked to play. It was a bitter truth, and Marlowe had no idea how to process it. Thatcher watched her, noticing the way she clenched her fists, her face set in a mixture of determination and heartbreak. He knew the weight of what she was carrying. He had seen it in his own life. The guilt, the regrets, the sense of being a part of something much larger than yourself. He knew he couldn't take away her pain, but he could stand beside her as she faced it. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice soft but full of concern. Marlowe nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'll survive. I have to. For him, for all the people who never got the chance to survive." Thatcher didn't know what to say to that. He had been part of a world where survival was the only option. But it was different now. Marlowe had already survived more than anyone should ever have to, and now she was facing a future where the road ahead was uncertain. The system they had just exposed was far-reaching, and there were no guarantees that they wouldn't be hunted, that those who had orchestrated this mess wouldn't retaliate. But for the first time in years, Thatcher allowed himself a moment of hope. Marlowe had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The fight wasn't over, but they had a chance, and that was something worth fighting for. "You're not alone in this," Thatcher said, stepping closer to her. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Marlowe turned to him, her gaze steady. There was something unspoken between them, a mutual understanding forged in the fire of the past few days. "I know," she said quietly. "Thank you. I don't think I could have done it alone." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the past, the present, and the future pressing down on them. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. They had exposed the truth, but they hadn't yet destroyed the system that had been built to hide it. Thatcher's thoughts wandered to Hollis. His old friend's legacy was now bound to Marlowe, and though the truth about Hollis's death had been shrouded in secrecy, Thatcher knew one thing for sure. Hollis had died trying to protect Marlowe. He had failed in some ways, but he had also given her the strength to fight. And that fight was far from over. Marlowe glanced at the door, her eyes narrowed as if searching for the next step, the next challenge. She had always been running from something, but now it seemed like she had stopped running. She had faced her past, and now she could decide how to move forward. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. "We need to make sure this doesn't get buried again. We've got a lot of work to do." Thatcher nodded. "We'll do it right. No more running." Together they walked out of the warehouse, leaving behind the remnants of the past and stepping into a future where the truth would no longer be hidden. The world had changed that night, and so had they. What came next was uncertain, but for the first time, Marlowe and Thatcher knew that they were ready for whatever the future held, and together they would face it. The sound of distant sirens faded into the night as Thatcher and Marlowe drove through the quiet streets, the city skyline looming in the rearview mirror. Their vehicle was a nondescript black car, one of many that had been used in their covert operations over the past few days. The journey from the warehouse had been long, and yet it felt like everything had shifted in an instant. The weight of their actions, the lives they had disrupted, the truths they had exposed, hung heavily in the air between them. But there was also something new, something quieter in their movements. A sense of change, of transformation, had settled in the space they shared. Marlowe sat silently beside Thatcher, her gaze distant. Her body was still recovering from the chaos of the past hours, but the emotional toll was far more profound. The journey she had been on was one of self-discovery, of unearthing truths she had never known about herself. Her entire life had been a carefully constructed lie, and now everything was on the table. But even though the truth had been revealed, it hadn't come without cost. The discovery of her father's legacy, the betrayal of her mother, the revelation of the project that had shaped her existence. It was a lot to process. She thought about the moments she had shared with her mother, Lena. For years, Lena had been a mystery to her, a woman who had kept her at a distance, who had hidden the truth. But Marlowe's recent discoveries had shown her that Lena wasn't just a protective mother. She had been complicit in the darkness that had tried to control their lives. Marlowe felt a pang of loss for the mother she had once idolized, but she also understood that there was no place for that idealization anymore. Her mother had made choices that had shaped their lives, choices that would forever change Marlowe's understanding of her past. The truth about her father, Hollis, was equally complicated. He had been a soldier, a protector, and, in many ways, he had tried to shield Marlowe from the very truth that had now come to light. He had died fighting to keep her safe, but in doing so, he had left behind a legacy of secrets that had made Marlowe's life more difficult than it needed to be. The revelation about Hollis's death, the corruption that had surrounded him, and the way his life had been overshadowed by forces beyond his control, it had shaken her to the core. Yet there was also something liberating about finally knowing who he had been. It gave her a sense of closure, and with that closure came a chance to step forward into a new reality. Thatcher, too, was lost in thought. As the man who had known Hollis better than anyone, he He carried his own burdens. He had never fully come to terms with his friend's death or the secrecy that had surrounded it. The past had always been something he had buried deep within himself. But now, standing beside Marlowe, he couldn't escape it any longer. The past was a part of him, a part of them both, and it had shaped the path they had walked to get to this point. He had never expected to find himself in this position, to be standing at the crossroads of right and wrong, to have to choose between loyalty to his friend and loyalty to the truth. But as he looked at Marlowe, he realized that this was no longer just about the past. It was about the future, about creating a world where people like Marlowe weren't exploited or manipulated, where the truth didn't have to hide in the shadows anymore. "How do you feel?" Thatcher asked, breaking the silence between them. Marlowe turned to him, her expression unreadable. She paused before answering, her voice quiet but steady. "I feel like I've lost everything and nothing at the same time," she said, her eyes searching the dark road ahead. "I've lost the version of myself that I thought was real. But I've also found something stronger, something more true. I found the truth, even if it's not what I wanted to hear." Thatcher nodded, understanding the complexity of her feelings. It's never easy to face the truth, especially when it's about the people you love. But you're doing it. You're standing up for yourself and for those who can't fight for themselves. Marlowe's lips tightened into a small, determined smile. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm done being controlled by what happened to me. I'm choosing what happens next." Thatcher couldn't help but admire her. There was a fire in her that he hadn't seen before. It was the same fire that had burned in Hollis, the same desire to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. And now that fire had ignited within Marlowe. As they neared their destination, the city lights flickering in the distance, Thatcher knew that they weren't done yet. The fight they had started wasn't over. The truth had been revealed, but the system that had built Project Helix wasn't going to collapse overnight. But for the first time, Thatcher felt a sense of certainty in the path they had chosen. They had taken the first step toward justice, toward making sure that no one else would ever have to live in the shadows of secrets and lies again. Marlowe looked over at him, her eyes steady. "We're not finished, are we?" she asked. Thatcher met her gaze, his jaw set with determination. "No," he replied, "but we're closer than we've ever been." And as they drove into the night, neither of them knew exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long while they felt ready to face it, together. We would really appreciate your support by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue creating these engaging stories and bring you even more exciting content. Marlowe stood in the dimly lit motel room, staring at the envelope that she had just pulled from the worn-out box under the bed. It was the same envelope she had discovered hidden in the piano all those years ago. The one her mother, Lena, had kept locked away, never to be opened. Now, with trembling hands, Marlowe unfolded the yellowed paper, feeling a mix of dread and anticipation as she read the words that would finally reveal everything. She had always known that her mother's past was shrouded in secrecy. Lena had raised her with a fierce protectiveness, always keeping her at arm's length from any hints of their family history. But as the years went by, the questions grew. Who was Marlowe's father really? What had happened to him? And why had her mother insisted that she never ask about the past? Now, as she read the contents of the letter, everything began to fall into place. The truth she had long suspected was far darker than she could have imagined. Her father, Hollis, had been a soldier, a protector, someone she had always been told had died in a mission gone wrong. But the letter revealed a chilling reality. Hollis had been part of a covert military operation, one so deeply secretive that even the highest-ranking officials had turned a blind eye to it. And Marlowe wasn't just his daughter by accident. She was the result of an experiment, a genetic project designed to manipulate and control individuals. Project Helix, the name that had come up so many times during Thatcher's investigation, was at the heart of it all. Her very existence had been engineered by forces beyond her control, hidden away from the world to protect the legacy of a project that was far more than a military experiment. It had been about creating something Someone who could carry on the work of the men behind the project. Someone who would carry the burden of their secrets without ever knowing it. Her mother, Lena, had been more than just a protective figure. She had been a part of it all, a willing participant in the program, helping to raise Marlo while keeping her in the dark about her true origins. Marlo had been used, manipulated, not just by the people behind the project, but by her own mother, who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe from the dangers that came with the truth. As Marlo reached the final lines of the letter, a cold realization settled over her. The people behind Project Helix were not just interested in her. They were watching her, waiting for her to awaken, to tap into the abilities they had engineered within her. They had spent years building her into something more than human, something they could control, something they could use. The letter ended abruptly, but its final words were clear. If you're reading this, it means I've failed to protect you. Do not trust anyone who tells you otherwise. The truth will come for you, but it will not come without a price. Marlo dropped the letter onto the table, her heart racing. The truth was out, but as it echoed in her mind, she realized something even more unsettling. The project wasn't over. She was still being hunted. The experiment had never truly ended, and now the people behind it were determined to reclaim what they had created. Thatcher's voice cut through her thoughts, interrupting the whirlwind of her emotions. We need to go. It's not safe here anymore. She looked at him, her expression hardening as she tucked the letter into her coat pocket. They know. They've known all along, and they're coming for me. Thatcher nodded, his jaw tight. Then we run, but this time we run on our terms. With one last look at the letter, Marlo turned to leave. The truth had been unveiled, but it had only opened a door to even greater danger. And now, they were both bound to face it. The revelation hit Marlo like a tidal wave, sweeping over her and leaving her breathless. For years, she had lived in the shadows of her past, only ever glimpsing fragments of her true identity. But now, as the truth unraveled before her, the weight of it was suffocating. Her existence, everything she had believed about herself, had been built on a lie. Her father's death, her mother's overprotectiveness, and the long history of secrecy weren't just coincidences. They were part of something far more insidious, a deliberate construction of her life as part of a covert, dangerous experiment. The letter, which she had carefully unfolded just moments ago, had revealed the depths of the deception. Hollis had never been the simple soldier she had imagined him to be. He wasn't just a man who had died protecting his country. He had been an integral part of Project Helix, a genetic manipulation program designed to create individuals like her. Individuals with extraordinary abilities and, most terrifyingly, a lack of choice in their own fates. Marlo clenched the letter in her hand, the crumpled paper a symbol of the truth she had fought so hard to avoid. She had always felt like an outsider in her own life, like something was missing, like there was something more that her mother wasn't telling her. But now she understood that she had been purposefully kept in the dark, not just for her safety, but to protect the very project that had given birth to her. As her thoughts churned, the final words of the letter echoed in her mind. The truth will come for you, but it will not come without a price. The price had already begun to make itself known. Marlo's fingers trembled as she looked at the worn envelope that had once been her mother's final message. The legacy of Project Helix wasn't just about creating a new generation of super soldiers. It was about controlling them, erasing their free will, and using them as pawns in a game much larger than anyone had ever realized. She had been part of that plan, a tool to be used, and her awakening was a threat to everything they had built. Thatcher watched Marlo with a quiet intensity, aware of the storm inside her. He had been there for every step of the journey, from the moment they first met, to the chaos in the warehouse, to now. The weight of the truth had hit her hard, and it was clear she was struggling to process it all. But he knew better than anyone that Marlo was no longer the naive woman she had been when she first collapsed in the airport. She had grown, had learned the brutal reality of her existence, and with that knowledge, she was becoming something stronger. Marlo, Thatcher said, his voice steady but filled with empathy, the truth is painful, but it's not your burden to carry alone anymore. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment they simply stood there, the noise of the outside world fading into the background. Marlowe had been forged in the crucible of deception, but now she could make her own choices. No longer just a puppet in the hands of Project Helix, she was her own person. And with the truth finally revealed, she could choose what to do with it. The silence was broken by the hum of a car engine starting in the distance. The people who had been behind the project weren't going to just let this slip away. They would come for her. Again. But this time, it was different. Marlowe wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. "We need to finish this," she said, her voice no longer trembling. "We need to make sure they never control anyone like this again." Thatcher nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "We will." As they prepared to leave, Marlowe knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with danger. But for the first time in her life, she was no longer running from the truth. She was ready to confront it head-on. And in doing so, she would reclaim her future. The days following their confrontation in the warehouse were a blur of fleeting moments, each one tinged with both exhaustion and a glimmer of hope. The truth had been exposed, the project had been crippled, and for the first time in years, Marlowe felt like she had taken control of her own destiny. But the road ahead wasn't paved with certainty. It was filled with obstacles, each one more dangerous than the last. The people behind Project Helix hadn't simply disappeared. They were waiting, watching, and they would stop at nothing to regain what they had lost. Yet, as Marlowe sat quietly in the small, nondescript room where they had taken refuge, a sense of peace washed over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with answers, for there were still many questions left unanswered. But it was the peace that came with knowing she was no longer a prisoner to the secrets of her past. For so long she had been running, trying to find answers, trying to escape the shadows. But now she had faced the truth. And though it had been painful, it had also been freeing. The truth had set her on a path she could control. Beside her, Thatcher sat, his gaze distant but steady. He had been her protector, her guide. And now, in this uncertain moment, he was the anchor she never realized she needed. They had both been through so much, and though the future was unclear, there was an undeniable bond between them, one forged in the fires of their shared journey. They had both sacrificed parts of themselves along the way, but now they were standing on the edge of something new, something bigger than either of them could have imagined when they first crossed paths. Marlowe knew the world was still filled with darkness, with powerful forces who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone in the fight. She had Thatcher, and together they were stronger than any shadow that sought to destroy them. She turned to him, her voice soft but filled with resolve. "We've won, but there's still so much more to do." Thatcher met her gaze, a slight smile on his lips. "Then we do it together." For the first time since the beginning of their journey, Marlowe felt like she had found her place in the world, not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as a woman with the power to make her own choices. The truth had restored her sense of self, and with it, a newfound sense of justice. There was still more work to be done. But with each step they took together, Marlowe knew that they could change the world, one truth at a time. The air outside was cool, the sky a soft gradient of dusk settling into night. It had been weeks since the warehouse confrontation, and Marlowe and Thatcher were still on the run. The world knew the truth now, about Project Helix, about the lives it had destroyed, about the corrupted systems that had enabled it to thrive for so long. But the fight for justice wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marlowe stood by the window, her eyes scanning the horizon, lost in thought. Despite everything that had happened, despite the undeniable victory they had achieved, there was still a gnawing emptiness within her. The truth had been revealed, yes, but it had come with a price she hadn't fully been able to process. She wasn't sure if the world she had uncovered would ever feel like a place where she truly belonged. She had spent so many years in the shadows, always running from the truth, trying to avoid the pain that came with knowing who she was. But now, with everything laid bare, Marlowe was faced with something far more difficult, choosing how to move forward in a world that felt both familiar and foreign. She had the truth. But it wasn't enough to heal the wounds of her past. It wasn't enough to make her forget the lies her mother had told her, or the horrific things she had uncovered about the experiment that had been her life's foundation. Thatcher, sitting on the couch, watched her closely. He knew the burden she carried, and he could see the weight of it in every step she took. Marlo had become something more than just a survivor. She had become a beacon of resistance, the symbol of everything they had fought for. But even the strongest people carried their scars, and Thatcher knew that healing wasn't a one-time event. It was a journey, a process. "We can't change the past," Thatcher said softly, breaking the silence, "but we can shape the future." Marlo turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I used to think that truth would set everything right, but it's not that simple, is it?" "No," Thatcher agreed. "It never is, but it's a start, and we're not alone anymore. Together, we'll make sure it counts." They stood in the silence, the unspoken promise between them strong and resolute. Marlo wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't face it alone. The truth had set her free in a way she never expected. And though the road ahead was uncertain, it was hers to walk. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and support our channel. Share the video with your friends and family and let us know in the comments what you think about the story. Would you want to see part 2? We'd love to hear your thoughts and share this journey with you.